Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast and another Marshals special. Boy, have I been looking forward to this one. It's no secret when it comes to this show and my views on the great or not so great Marshal Murat. So we've been threatening you with this one for quite some time, dropping not so much teasers as just clanging spoilers on Rachel and my views on this. But today we are going to look at Murat in what could very easily descend into just a stream of conscious style rant about the guy. And well, I say that the ranting will probably come from me. It won't come from Rachel because she's always on form. Rachel, great to see you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me back.
Well, it's always fun to do these. But yes, Murat, I mean, it's interesting. I said we are going to talk about interpretations at the end, but I've been reading up, as you'd imagine, in Chandler. That's always the starting point when you're going to do any kind of reading on the marshals. And I was very struck that the Murat that comes through in the chapter in Napoleon's Marshals is quite a world away from the Murat that I know from my own reading and research. And it's interesting that you get this kind of clash of interpretations. And we talked about this off air, and I think it's such an interesting point that we should probably touch on it again. You do get a lot of polarization with a number of the marshals, but Murat, it's sort of you're a voice out on a limb on your own if you end up critiquing Murat. And I get some well-meaning abuse for the fact that I'm not a fan. Why is there this sort of inclination to split opinions? Well, I guess not so much split opinions, is just kind of go, yeah, he was great, and not really be wholly subjective about it.
I think Murat of all the marshals has the most glamorous reputation, because his life was one giant melodrama. He liked to dress well, he was dandified, he liked massive grand gestures, he had a tremendously good opinion of himself. And that glamour, I think, extends basically down to the current day. And there's an element of the charisma and the drama of it, I think, for want of a better word, that appeals to people. So when you compare him to people like Lefebvre or Jourdan or Kellerman, who were solid, decent, good men, and I don't think even some of Murat's biggest supporters would say he was a very good man off the battlefield. People think they're boring, and I remember not too long ago on Twitter there was a discussion about Marshal Ney and had he escaped to America, etc. And people were saying, "Oh, Ney and Murat died like legends." It was, their end was so emphatic. It was so, again, I'm struggling for another word other than dramatic, but it inspired so much story and imagery and art, etc., that this was the way a Marshal of France should surely go out if they'd grown old and died of natural causes. It somehow lacked heroism, which I staunchly disagree with. But I think people are drawn to Murat's story because it is so fantastical and it's so colourful. And there's no doubt about it that Murat was phenomenally physically brave. And I think people buy into that and very often will lose sight of his failings. And it's a bit like if you try critiquing Napoleon, we could focus on loads of things Napoleon did well, and the drama and the charisma and the romanticism of Napoleon's life, that a lot of people kind of feel it compensates for the weaknesses. So they see the dashing cavalryman, they see the guy who led the magnificent charge at Eylau, they see the man who would ride out on his own, gaudily dressed in Russia with not a care as to whether he'd be captured, and think, what a hero. But unfortunately, they don't always think about this was the man who had fantastically poor judgment, who was incredibly immoral most of the time, who ultimately was one of the Napoleonic marshals who had the biggest betrayal of Napoleon. And we've discussed multiple times now on the podcast and off air about how people react when you mention Bernadotte or Marmont, who both, you could say, arguably didn't necessarily betray, but made judgments that they felt were appropriate at the time. Murat's was total self-interest. So I feel like because of his glamour, or by virtue of that glamorous story, he gets away with a hell of a lot more than he deserves to.
I mean, if there's one word for me to describe Murat, it's swashbuckling, right? And I think that has a glamour. There's sort of almost this, if we were to draw comparisons with modern sort of pop culture characters, there's a sort of Johnny Depp-esque style swagger to the guy.
Yeah.
You know, you can imagine him just sort of striding into a bar, ripping off the cork of a bottle with his teeth, probably doing something rather scandalous with a number of the folks who run the establishment, and then sort of throwing down a gold hilted sword and sort of striding out, and everybody sort of going, you know, there's a certain type of individual, and you know, take it how you like in terms of whether you admire somebody of that ilk or not. That's for you to make a personal judgment on.
Yeah.
But because there is that sort of that drama, and as you say, the bravery, and the one thing you can never take away from Murat is phenomenally brave. It's almost like the guy didn't have a self-preservation instinct.
No, I don't
within
think he
him.
did.
I mean, there are other, I mean, we're talking about sort of positives. There are some early signs that he might be inclined to do the right thing. There are also some early signs that he might not be inclined to do the right thing. It struck me reading that Chandler chapter that when his brother dies, he does the right thing by his sister-in-law and their family. But then
Yes,
there's so much else.
yeah, he supports his widowed sister and his nephews and nieces. I think a bit like Napoleon, I think he could be a very sentimental man. So I don't think his feelings, and certainly he was a man who was very, very devoted to his children. So I don't think he could ever be accused of coldness. But he had a lot of, as we've said, physical bravery, moral courage, not so much, I don't think. Which is, again, when we compare him to some of the less glamorous marshals, you know, we've already discussed MacDonald on an earlier episode. I am chief of the Marshal Lefebvre fan club and Team Davout. Again, not particularly glamorous men. You certainly, not the kind you'd want to go for a drink with or anything like that, or certainly not when it's Davout. But they had a different sort of courage. It was battlefield, but also off battlefield. And Napoleon, who was very reluctant to ever own anybody as ranking above himself, said that on the battlefield, Murat was probably the bravest man in the world. And for Napoleon to rank him above himself, you know, that's saying something. But equally, he said off the battlefield, he was a poltroon with no judgment. He was unreliable. He couldn't make a sensible decision. He went through women like most people needed food. He was just fool off the battlefield. And those are Napoleon's own words.
I think we'll probably end up dissecting that in quite some depth in due course. But let's start inevitably at the beginning. There's a punchline in here somewhere, isn't there? That this guy is destined initially for the priesthood. I mean, can you imagine what this guy would have been like if he'd taken the cloth?
Let's be realistic. I cannot think of any human being of that era less suited to the priesthood than Joachim Murat. There is not a single characteristic of the priesthood that he could have met. Modesty, decency, celibacy, denying himself any sort of pleasure. Absolutely no way. But I mean, that was what his parents had intended for him. He was one of 12 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. And although he certainly came from a family that had been considered nobodies in the time of the Ancien regime, his parents were reasonably decently off. They kept the village inn and posting house, and it was their intention that their youngest son would become a priest. So at the age of 10, he went off to the nearby school in Cahors, And he did well enough there. I mean, again, there's the tendency to sort of caricature Murat as a complete himbo. Um, he wasn't a complete moron. He could do some things, albeit not necessarily always very well. But he did well enough there at school to be accepted into a seminary at Toulouse. And so it looks on the face of it as he enters his 20th year that Murat is going to make good on his family ambition and he's going to become Father Murat. But he runs away from the seminary in 1787. And some accounts as to why he ran away differ, but it's generally accepted it was over a woman. And let's be realistic, that's what sounds pretty much Murat. But the affair didn't last, so he'd run away with her. He disgraced himself to his family. He turned his back on the seminary. I keep wanting to say ceremony, not seminary. He spent all his money and he was left in disgrace, no cash, no girlfriend anymore, and needing to find something else to do with his life. And as fate would have it, a regiment of chasseurs was passing through Toulouse at the time. Murat was quite struck with the uniforms, approached one of the officers, and the next day left Toulouse as a soldier and not a priest.
Murat taken by uniforms? I am shocked by
I know,
that.
who would have guessed it?
Who would have thought? But he's starting at the bottom, right? And this is one of those things where you can, credit where it's due. The guy shows competence and he shows considerable loyalty. We'll get into this, I think, a little bit later, but a considerable loyalty, almost zealousism, actually. I'm not even sure if that's a word, but we'll go with it. We'll say it's a word. Zealotism towards the revolution. He's a career soldier. He works his way all the way up. And there's a sense that, he can be trusted. He's given, postings and missions and positions that matter. There are times when he's, multiple times, in fact, where he's ADC to significant generals in the early Revolutionary Wars. So the military career is pretty good before he gets anywhere near a guy called Napoleon.
Yeah, his service is really solid. He, like the vast majority of the marshals, and again, this thing, I think, regardless of where we stand on them as people or their later careers, there's no doubting that they had all done their time in the revolution. They had all worked themselves up through grit and competence. Regardless of which marshals you're drawn to or not drawn to, they all had earned the baton in one way or another. And yeah, he starts from the bottom, but thanks to his education, his time in the seminary, he's literate. And that's a relative rarity for the time. So he very quickly works his way up to sergeant major. And he performs very well. He at one point's on the constitutional guard of the king, ostensibly formed for Louis's protection, but obviously that being basically just a ruse. And by October of 1792, he's a lieutenant. So the revolution, very much like the majority of the marshals, takes this guy from very humble beginnings, not abject poverty, but he was not a man who was ever going to hold a commission under the Ancient regime, and lifts him up that next stage. He kind of comes in for a little bit of a bashing from both sides. At one point, one of his officers denounces him as a noble, and in a sort of fit of revolutionary patriotism, he takes to signing his name Marat rather than Murat to sort of symbolize just how devoted he is to the revolutionary cause. This kind of backfires at a later date when he gets accused of supporting the terror, and that being evidence of that. But he's absolutely committed to the revolution as much as Murat could ever be committed to anything. And his service is, pretty impressive, actually.
I love the caveat that you throw in there of as much as Murat could be committed to anything, he was committed to the revolution. It was interesting, actually, looking at his time in Louis' sort of the Constitutional Government Guard, because he leaves that unit, doesn't he, over ostensibly sort of corruption and treason allegation, not leveled at Murat, but apparently officers are trying to recruit him to an emigre unit and are offering him substantial sums of money, and he turns them down.
Hmm.
This shows an integrity that we wouldn't necessarily associate it, certainly with the caricature that I tend to draw of the guy.
No, certainly in his early service, he shows a lot more restraint and certainly a little bit better judgment than he would show the higher up through the ranks he got.
Yeah, that's very much a sense that I get, that as all people do, and I've talked about this before. One of the big bugbears I have about Napoleon is this notion that he's a constant.
Yeah.
The Napoleon of 1796 is not the Napoleon of 1806, or far less sort of 1814, 15. So
Mhm.
with Murat, it's perhaps unsurprising that he changes, and there is perhaps this sense, and that's debatable, of the power going to his head. Um, I talked earlier about how he was kind of zealously pro-revolutionary. You talked about the times where he kind of gets a pasting from both sides. And it's quite ironic, if anybody would have loved the sort of dramatic flourish with which you could produce a birth certificate and denounce your senior officer for levelling false allegations. His commander suggesting that he was an aristocrat or linked to the aristocracy, being able to show those credentials of actually, no, I've come up from nothing or relatively nothing, would
Mhm.
certainly have appealed to Murat's nature. But he's part of this sort of poacher hussar unit, isn't he? Where they
Mhm.
have to kind of act against enemies of the revolution. Now he's encouraged to take that position. It represents a step in promotion. He does it. He has issues with his CO, who's the guy who makes these accusations. Um, but the fact that he's willing to serve in that unit kind of shows a dedication to it. But then equally, he is, I would argue, the linchpin of the whole whiff of grape shot incident. The Vendômière 13th, I always ruin the pronunciation, 13th Vendômière.
That's how I pronounce it. So we'll go with
Okay,
Vendômière.
we'll go with that. Um, I always think of it as the whiff of grape shop incident. He's the guy who secures the guns, and you've got both sides going for those artillery pieces. And Murat turns around and says, "You stand in my way, I will cut you down."
Hmm.
So the fact that there are any artillery pieces for Napoleon to deploy to defend the government is fundamentally down to him. You could, and I probably would, make the case that Murat probably saves the government on that occasion
Yep.
rather than Napoleon, because without Murat, there is nothing for Napoleon to do other than make a decision whether he's going to stand in the way and potentially get shot.
Yeah, absolutely. The When I wrote a blog on Vendômière, well, I think it was last year, it's the day people associate with the rising of Napoleon star, but it's the day I call the making of Marshal Murat, because ultimately, had Napoleon had no artillery, realistically, there might never have been Napoleon as we know him. He might have been a young officer who was massacred by the mob when it rose up against the Directory. There is every chance he and his men might have gone the way of the Swiss Guards. It's only because of Murat's timely action that he got to the guns in time, that he threatened to cut down the National Guardsmen who were trying to take them, and got them back to Napoleon, that Napoleon was able to disperse the mob. Realistically, he, from that day on, ties his fate to Napoleon's for the rest of his life.
He does. I mean, it's interesting that it's Napoleon whose star rises all the way to the top. We'll talk, I suspect, more about the Brumaire coup in due course, and Murat within that whole incident. But in the immediate aftermath of Vendômière, is there a kind of a power struggle between the two of them? Of okay, they've got different ranks at that point in time, I believe, but that sort of sense of Murat being a guy who likes people to know what he's done, right? He makes all of these grand gestures for a reason, and that's because partly it's his character, and partly because he wants that affirmation from
Mm-hmm.
people. And yet here comes this guy Napoleon, who he sights the artillery and he gives the order to fire. But without Murat, he's nothing. So is there this sort of, I guess, friction between the two of them, of Murat thinking, well, you owe as much to me as I owe to you in these early days when they're together in Italy?
I never get the sense of that being the case. I think as much as Murat was a flamboyant individual, Napoleon, as we've discussed, was an intensely charismatic one. And he was very good at making people not fall under a spell. That's a very cliched way of saying it, but he could draw people in and earn their admiration very, very quickly, whether it was, given with given grudgingly or not. And I think Murat recognized that he was savvy enough to recognize that Napoleon was the man to hitch his wagon to if he wanted to rise further. His career was obviously going in the right direction, but I think he knew that at Napoleon's side it would change trajectory even altogether. And it's interesting that he requested to accompany Napoleon as his ADC. And Napoleon, in typical Napoleon fashion, anytime someone had rendered him a good service, the marshals especially, he was quick to reward it, and he was a very generous rewarder. And he grants Murat's request straight away, because I think, again, likewise, he understood that Murat was a man he could make good use of, and that was it. They were tied together with the closest personal links of any of the marshalate from that point forward.
This is true. I mean, they end up being sort of thick as thieves the whole way through, don't they? It again, to go back to that chapter in Chandler, it's interesting that the author of that piece kind of cites Egypt as the point at which Napoleon decides that he can't do without Murat. But is it Napoleon who requests Murat to be with him based on the time in Italy when Napoleon sails to Egypt, or is it the other way around? I forget.
Yeah. Murat's service in Italy was really very good indeed. That's where he really showcases himself as a man who can lead cavalry and can lead cavalry extremely well. And we could go through all the battles. I mean, it's an enormous list of battles, Dago and Mondovi, and he was at Genoa, he was at Bassano, he was at Saraya even. I'm probably massacring these pronunciations, for which I apologize. Montebaldo. He's given the honour of taking captured enemy flags back to Paris alongside Junot, who had been a very close friend of Napoleon's for a lot longer. So the fact he's given this mark of honour, I think, is a measure of Napoleon's recognition of his talents. And it's Napoleon who names him commander of a brigade in what is initially the Army of England, which becomes the Army of the Orient. And so he sets sail to Egypt and again performs really well. He adds camels to his cavalry and actually makes really effective use of them. He fights at Alexandria, he fights at the pyramid, and he's really, by this point, made his reputation as one of the finest cavalry officers of the era. And it's not an undeserved distinction, because as a cavalry commander, he was very good.
What makes them particularly stand out? Is it that bravery element? Is it a good eye for a tactical opening? Is it the nature of his leadership? I guess the logical kind of sub question to that is, what is he like as a leader? Why does he have this reputation as one of, if not the best cavalry commanders that Napoleon has at his disposal?
I think he kind of epitomizes what people think about cavalrymen for the era, the gaudy uniforms, the dash, the bravery. And in terms of as a figure who can inspire, he loves these grandiose gestures. He 100% leads from the front. He expects his men to follow. And I think the example of physical courage he gave must have been incredibly inspiring for the men who followed him. But he had a good tactical eye for the use of cavalry. He was never a strategist. And that would kind of come sort of crashing, the realization of that, would come crashing to him several years later when he thought that he and Napoleon would be sort of equals in the planning of strategy. Whereas Napoleon set the strategic direction, it was Murat's job to develop the tactics to make it happen, as it was with most of the marshals. So he had a good tactical eye, but he was never a strategist.
What was he like in terms of control? Because this is the other thing that occurs to me, that distinction that we always draw between British and French cavalry is that the the quality is there when it comes to British cavalry. We describe them as some of the best in the world and some of the worst led because of this inability to control the cavalry. That classic thing that we talk about on many occasions of the British cavalry kind of being let loose and never being able to rein themselves in and reform, and therefore just kind of squandering themselves as a force. They're a fire and forget weapon almost, which is not what you want with cavalry. Whereas with Murat, you really don't get that sense. Austerlitz being a key example, he seems to have this ability to, I guess, maintain the necessary degree of control. How much of that is personal? How much of that is influence in how the cavalry is trained, and how much of that is just the ethos within the French cavalry arm that you are a bit more conservative in terms of letting the men off the leash, so that you can then rein them back in and make them reform.
Honestly, I think a bit of a mixture of the three. And when you look at some of the other marshals who commanded cavalry, that you get that same sense that they don't saying they don't squander horses is maybe a slight over egging of the pudding, because Murat in particular would later on in his career would tire out numerous horses a day. But I think they had a very good sense of what was realistic and what would happen in the event they lost control. I think some of that maybe particularly did stem from the revolution as well, where they had to account for their every decision, and overzealousness could get you, on the steps of the guillotine just as much as underzealousness could. But Napoleon brought with him a sense of order, and he expected his commanders to be at their A game as well. And he expected people to be able to account for their decisions. And the redevelopment of the staff system, etc., under Berthier, they had a very good sense of where everything was and the value of every individual piece of equipment, every horse, etc. So I do think they had a better sense of what would happen if you threw away your cavalry.
So we've got to that point where we then kind of reach that pivot, right, with the Brumaire coup, where, as we all know, Napoleon ascends. But forgive me if I'm wrong here. Well, I know I'm right in saying that Napoleon's not the first choice, but I believe Murat was. Is that
He,
right?
um, in some circles, he had again this panache of personality, and other circles claim MacDonald. But he's invaluable to the success of Brumaire because, as we know, initially things were not going well for Napoleon. People were calling out for him to be shot. There comes a time where it looks in the chamber like he's going to be overrun, and Murat comes dashing in and effectively comes to Napoleon's rescue.
I mean, there's a whole episode to be done, quite frankly, on the Brumaire coup. There's a whole series of episodes to be done on the Brumaire coup. He says, chalking that up as yet another thing that needs to be done on this show. But let's move on and let's kind of, well, actually, let's pause for a moment and discuss the family man and where the
Yeah.
sort of the arrival of family sort of happens within the context of Murat's story. In as much as you can call him a family man, before we start to charge on and look at other battles. We kind of dropped a clanger of a spoiler in the sense that he likes to chase the ladies. Shall we put it that way?
Yeah.
And so I imagine he didn't make a particularly good husband in that regard.
No, he was serially unfaithful, as was Caroline Bonaparte, it has to be said. And she had a long string of entanglements as well, including Metternich. Um, but after Brumaire, he really solidified his position at Napoleon's side. He'd been useful in Egypt. He'd been useful at Vendômière. He had very much helped save the day at the Brumaire coup, and Napoleon was grateful. And it was not long afterwards that he would marry Napoleon's youngest and, without a doubt, least pleasant sister, Caroline. Um, she was 16, he was 30, so it was a
Yeah.
fair old age gap. I mean, not uncommon for the time, obviously. Um, but she was no pushover to be sort of ill-treated either. As I say, he was serially unfaithful, she was serially unfaithful. Um, and like most of Napoleon's siblings, she had all of his vices and very few of Napoleon's good characteristics. And together they made one hell of a demanding pair. When Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, Caroline was adamant that she should be an imperial princess and threw the queen mother of all tantrums until she got what she wanted. So by virtue, Murat became an imperial prince. They treated Josephine appallingly. All the Bonaparte women hated Josephine. And Murat and Caroline together would throw really lavish parties and effectively pimp mistresses out to Napoleon. And it was through them that Napoleon's first illegitimate child was born, because they wanted to prove, because obviously Josephine had given birth twice. She'd had Eugene and Hortense. So I think there'd maybe been a degree of doubt on Napoleon's part as to whether effectively he was infertile. And they were happily hooking him up where they could, because the evidence of the illegitimate child arriving was proof that Josephine was no longer able to bear children. She was no longer able to found a dynasty. And they wanted her out of the way. And I think it was what Murat and Caroline would also have liked was for Napoleon to name their children as his heirs.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting one, isn't it? This is one of the things you put in the show notes. You know, nothing ever seems to quite be enough for Murat, and arguably by pushing him to have this sort of string of dalliances and then prove that he could found a dynasty, um, it kind of encourages him to think beyond Josephine, perhaps, and start to realistically pursue another marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the process, of course, they end up writing themselves out of the succession
Yeah.
because, you know, there is an heir that he produces in due course. So I mean, they do sound like absolute pieces of work. Um, in that sense, you almost kind of feel that they would have been well suited to
They
each other.
deserve they deserved each other, and I think they 100% brought out the worst in each other. And it's at this time any sort of degree of moderation or good judgment that Murat had shown in his early career gets chucked out the window. And with some of the marshalates, again, I'll cheerlead for Marshal Lefebvre. They never lost sight of what they had been. They understood that they were a new nobility, but they had come up through the ranks. They were men who'd begun with nothing and worked their way up. The minute Murat starts accumulating titles, he believes he is as legitimate a prince or as deserving of a title as any other person in Europe. And he fully sort of supports the ideal of himself as a great man. He gets carried away with his own importance. And I think really his vanity, he'd always been a vain person. He loved designing his uniforms. He loved to look, glittering and gaudy, but he really started to get carried away with his own importance, and judgment went out the window, and anything he could get his hands on, titles, money, influence, he was going to fight for it.
He did it very well, though. I mean, this was a guy who could style an ostrich feather on a uniform better than any other man alive before, during, or since the period, quite frankly. Um, as I commented many times, when you look at a portrait of Murat, you do get a very clear sense that he knew how to market his thighs above
Yes.
all else. It's quite remarkable. Um, but let us move away from Murat's thighs and onto something of more historical relevance. He's second on the list of marshals. How much of that is loyalty, and how much of that is, genuinely deserved? I mean, this is where the Chandler chapter kind of points to he's proven himself in Egypt, and here is his reward. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Personally, I would disagree slightly. So he's second on this list of the marshals, and he's second only to Berthier, whose value is sort of beyond quantifiability. But when you think now, Murat's track record had been good, but when you think of people like Massena and Augereau and these revolutionary generals whose track record is enormous and whose contribution to Napoleon's early, victories is enormous, I think there's an element of I am going to reward my sister's husband. He no, there's no denying he deserved his baton. Did he deserve to be ranked second? I would disagree with that personally.
I mean, it's the sort of thing that would appeal to his vanity, isn't
Oh, for
it? Does he
sure.
does he ever try and play on that? I'm number two in the list of marshals, so the rest of you can shut up.
Yes, and he is not particularly well liked among the rest of the marshalate because he annoys them. He's vain and he boasts, and again, he's incredibly self-important. His sort of closest friend among the marshalate, if you're going to say that he had a best friend, is Marshal Bessières. The two of them were as thick as thieves, and I've seen Bessières described as sort of Murat's understudy. And that's maybe not a totally unfair way of describing him. The two of them were certainly thick as thieves, but a lot of the other marshals had no time for him. Davout thought he was an idiot. Ney had precious little time for him. He just could rub people up the wrong way.
So let's talk about other engagements. Austerlitz is often cited as one of those moments of Murat at his best, right? The command of cavalry on a very kind of a section of the battlefield that is very key to Napoleon's success that day. Talk us through what he does there and its significance, and how is he rewarded for that? Because he's already a marshal, right? So how do you keep heaping, the praise on this guy to keep him interested, right? Because that's part of what he's doing this for.
Yeah, so I'll need to look for his list of the numerous rewards he actually gets. But so yeah, he's a linchpin in the victory of Austerlitz himself, and primarily Soult and Davout of the Marshalate are probably play the most important roles. And he does the same at Jena, his pursuit of the three marshals, where he rounds up basically or charges down the enemy forces. He is made a Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor. He is given various, as I say, I'll have to look up his full list of titles. I don't have it in front of me, the various rewards that he gets. But he's further ennobled by Napoleon by being made a Grand Duke of Berg and Cleves, because again, primarily to reward Murat for his use, but also to answer the inevitable nagging from Caroline that she wanted to be made more. He was installing his other siblings on thrones. He was handing out titles to them left, right, and centre. She felt, why would they being ignored? And so eventually they're given this new title, a Grand Duke. And I can only imagine how it must have stuck in the gullets of some of the other marshals that they had to refer to Murat as a Grand Duke, because he was, becoming a sort of sovereign prince almost in his own right.
Does he deserve the title? I mean, Eylau, you talked about earlier, and that's one of the most complimentary things I think you've said in the last hour about Murat is his conduct at Eylau. Talk us a bit through that, and I guess to what extent does he demonstrate that competency and ends up being sufficiently key to success on the battlefield that actually he kind of merits some of these. And, not that we're going to draw direct comparisons with Davout, but, compare that to other marshals and what they do. Does the family connection mean that Murat gets that bit more than he deserves?
I think he gets a lot, and in some cases more than the other marshals, thanks to the family connection. But there's no denying that on the battlefield was where Murat shone. And in terms of his strengths, regardless of what he was off the battlefield, on the battlefield as a cavalry commander, there is no doubting that he was of immense importance to Napoleon. So at Eylau, for example, Augereau's court was almost completely destroyed. And it's only really thanks to Murat leading, this charge of 10,000 cavalry that they were able to turn the tide. Now, it wasn't a tremendous victory for France because the losses were so heavy, but Murat decimated the Russian centre and effectively saved the day. He turned what could have been an enormous defeat into an admittedly muted victory because the losses were so bad, but he won the day for France there. And there's absolutely no denying the victory was Murat's. So he does deserve the rewards in as much as all the other marshals do. They all have their finest hours, whether it be Erstadt for Davout or for somebody like Massena. He had several finest hours, if we want to be honest. Becoming very, very useful at Wagram before we even go back through his catalogue of victories. So I think it would be doing a disservice to Murat to say he didn't deserve any rewards, because just that sort of triumvirate of Austerlitz, Jena, and Eylau show his competencies and show his excellence as a cavalry commander.
So the next thing that comes along is, of course, the crown, right? Dare I ask what he's like as a king? This is an interesting one, actually, because I've had pushback from one of my most reasonable fans of the show, somebody who's always kind of driven by the evidence, and he's kind of said, "Look, Zach, look beyond the usual kind of stuff, and even look beyond the battlefield, and look at the letters, and you see that actually, as king, Murat demonstrates some better qualities." What's your take on that?
Yeah, actually, as a king, in terms of what his reign accomplishes, he's not actually the worst of the Napoleonic monarchs or the vassal monarchs that Napoleon installs around Europe. They run into the same problems as he has with all his other vassal monarchs, in that Napoleon installed Murat in Naples with a view to him being a French vassal who would govern in French interests first. And Murat, like all the other examples, like his brother in Holland and like Joseph in Spain, he wants to govern in the interest of the country he's been appointed to lead. And give Murat his due, he wants to put Neapolitan interests first, which brings him into, exactly the same kind of clashes with Napoleon over the continental system. He wanted to give honours to Neapolitans rather than French officers. And he kind of bristled about the idea that he was effectively having to pay to feed what was essentially an army of occupation with French troops. And so you do get the sense that he did genuinely want to try and do his best for Naples. He and Caroline quarrelled a lot, and there were sort of king's factions and queen's factions. And it's been suggested that actually Caroline was the better statesman because, again, Murat had his weaknesses. But when you look at what he tried to accomplish, things like the abolition of feudalism and trying to modernize Naples, he genuinely did accomplish some good things. And that same chapter in Chandler kind of suggests that Murat began the sort of campaign for Italian unification, that the Italy we know today as a united country sort of goes as far back as Murat and his decisions as king of Naples. So that, I mean, he didn't squander it away. I mean, they looked after themselves, and again, for him it was another excuse to design more clothes and to feel himself even more grand. And later on in Russia, when he clashed with Davout very smartly reminded him that he was only a king because Napoleon had appointed him so. Murat believed the minute the crown went on his head, he was a king with as much right to his throne and as much pedigree and as much sort of authority as any other monarch in the world. So again, you have this sense of his vanity and self-importance kind of dims down what might actually been a set of reasonably good accomplishments.
It's interesting. As you're saying that, I'm mulling over in my own head to what extent is that a reflection of him looking at Napoleon, but then Napoleon is always dogged by that concern of legitimacy and that fear that he won't be regarded as a legitimate monarch. And I wouldn't quite go so far as to describe that as paranoia, but I think that fear certainly drives a lot of his foreign policy. And I'm trying to weigh up whether or not I think Murat is kind of Napoleon's understudy in that respect. But I think that's probably to do a disservice to Napoleon, perhaps, on that occasion. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think Napoleon very much, a lot of his actions, his fervency for matchmaking in particular, matching Eugene up with his bride, and he sort of strong-armed Berthier into a aristocratic marriage, tried the same with Bessières, who refused him. He wanted to build all this dynastic connections to almost elevate his court, to sort of brush away the accusations that they were all sort of usurpers or that they were all nobodies. I don't know that Murat ever seemed to have a crisis of confidence, ever. He was 100% assured of his legitimacy as a ruler, and I think if anybody questioned him, he would have argued till he was blue in the face that I am King Joachim and I deserve my throne.
I mean, he really does not strike you as somebody who was ever plagued by anxiety, does he? Yes, we've tried very, very hard to give Murat his due over the course of this. This could have been a Let's Bash Murat podcast from the first second through to the last, but I think we've done a good job of being balanced. Now we get to the parts of the story where you just have to sort of scratch your head and go, this guy really wasn't the brightest button in the box. The first one is my favorite rant when it comes to Murat. And yes, Todd, I know I always refer back to the Dos de Mayo uprising and his handling of it, but I'm going to absolutely do that again today because for me, this shows a complete lack of appreciation of other people's perspectives and a lack of understanding of how you get people on side. And this is what I find quite odd that, he can be comparatively successful as a king. And yet what he shows at the Dos de Mayo, when he turns around and says that any French blood spilled will be paid multiple times over and then follows through on it, it's not just an idle threat. In the face of a situation where the locals are obviously agitated about the fact that their monarchs have been de facto kidnapped, they're concerned that the rest of the royal family is being packed up and shipped off to France to face a similar fate. To respond in that way shows a complete. I'm not going to use the word empathy because I don't think empathy is relevant in this situation. He's there as Napoleon's representative. He's there as a Marshal of France. Of course, he's there to represent French interests. And sure, he has a responsibility to his troops, but Murat's actions don't so much kind of pour fuel on the bonfire as pour, I don't know, gunpowder on the bonfire, right, and just blow the whole thing apart, so that this spark that is the Dostomir uprising just goes across country like wildfire.
Yeah.
Why does he manage to make such a pig's ear of it?
I mean, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. He absolutely screws up on an epic scale. And just as much as he was a positive linchpin in the 13th of Vendôme, he sticks the boot in Spain, and things just get worse from that point. I mean, it's sheer brutality on a human level. I mean, there's absolutely no justification. You could argue either way, but if we take the human cost out of it, the complete lack of foresight, the notion that if we brutalize these people, they're going to turn around and accept us, we're going to cow them into submission. It just shows the lack, again, this total inability to think on a larger scale beyond a problem that was in front of him. And if Murat was faced with a problem he couldn't charge, shoot, or sleep with, he didn't know what to do. And if you compare him to some of the other marshals, somebody like Suchet, for example, whose approach in Spain was so diametrically opposite, he had no sort of political savviness or no subtlety about him, that he couldn't get his head around. Maybe brutalizing these people isn't the best way forward. And for none of the marshals, brutality in Spain never paid off. It was a completely different avenue of war to Central Europe. And most of them didn't appreciate it. Napoleon didn't appreciate it. And it came back to bite them in the behind, big style. But yeah, throwing a bomb on it, I mean, an entire cart of gunpowder was what Murat threw on Spain. And again, we've tried to be balanced, but this is Murat at his most moronic. Like, I have no idea what he could have thought other than for the pure revenge of wanting to get his own back on the Spanish people. I can't otherwise see what he could have hoped to accomplish.
I think we have a new best quote on this podcast ever. If Murat didn't know what to do with a problem that he couldn't charge, shoot, or sleep with, if we ever make mugs, that is going on a mug. That is sublime. I love it. But to talk about the seriousness behind this, yes, you're absolutely right. We're on the same page on this, aren't we? But for me, it shows a lack of appreciation of the Spanish character. It shows, as you kind of said, it's a very sort of narrow-minded, immediate, sort of tactical mentality, as opposed to a wider geopolitical / strategic mentality. I'm not saying that the Peninsular War is all on Murat. I'm not. You know, there is a lot that goes into this thing, you know, turning into the problem that it becomes for Napoleon. There's no question that Napoleon shouldn't have meddled in the way that he did.
But he certainly didn't.
Exactly. You know, the fact that it ends up becoming such a big issue across such a wide proportion of, I mean, the Tres de Mayo, right? The executions are the ultimate propaganda coup for the Spanish resistance side. And that is on Murat. And it's that injustice fused with the injustice the Spanish feel and the injured pride that they feel over what's happening to their royal family that ends up being this sort of perfect cocktail.
Yeah.
We've talked about Spain. We should also talk about Russia, I guess. And this is another moment for me where I step back and I look at the guy and go, you're incredibly brave, but you're suicidally reckless in that bravery. And I'm talking here about the moment where he tries to shame one of his colleagues into going on the attack, by saying, well, look, if you won't attack the enemy, I will attack the enemy personally with my staff, and then proceeds to charge at the Russians with about 30 odd men at his side, and somehow comes away alive, not having really achieved anything, but having made his point. I guess the open-ended question. This is sort of more an existential thing rather than one for this show. Is at what point does bravery become foolhardiness? And for me, this is one of those moments where you go, this crosses a line in terms of, yes, okay, you're incredibly brave and you can admire that. And I do admire it. You know, I would not have the guts to do what he did. Hold my hands up to that. But that's probably because rationally I would look at it and go, what am I going to achieve by doing this? And it seems like that's just not there with him sometimes.
No. And that's commented on by contemporaries at the time. You know, Savary said of Murat, he'd have been better served with a little bit less bravery and a little bit more sense. Or if I can sum it up on a more vulgar level, Murat's problem was he was all balls, no brains. And their physical bravery is something I'm a complete coward, so I'm very admiring of people who can demonstrate physical courage in the way that most of the marshals did. But it has its uses up to a point. And if it gets to the point where you are throwing lives away needlessly, I don't think it's admirable any further. And his own lack of self-preservation, his own lack of care for his own safety, yes, it's admired, and it's certainly inspired other soldiers to follow him. Again, he was a very charismatic leader. He could get people on side by saying, you know, if you're going to cower, look at me. I'm going to go and charge the enemy. And he would ride out ahead of his staff. He would scout out on his own, you know, not subtly dressed, very much in his glittering gold uniforms and ostrich feathers and whatever, to make a statement. And the Cossacks themselves were so impressed with him that they decided he was never to be killed. They wanted to capture him, but they didn't want to shoot him out of pure respect for his bravery. And he, you know, initially in Russia, performs reasonably well. He fights at Smolensk, he fights at Krasny, he fights at Borodino. And Murat dismounted as the French soldiers were retreating all around him, and basically dared the soldiers to leave him to the Russians. And again, it's this sort of bravery in the moment, this charisma, this inspirational element. He kind of halts the retreat and manages to save a modicum of credit. But the problem is, here's where Murat's lack of moral courage or his self-interest, for me, pushes where to the point that I can't find Murat an admirable character. Again, he'd had that throne purely because Napoleon handed it out. And when Napoleon departed the army, Murat starts to think, I need to think about my own interests. Now, he didn't have the moral conviction to confront Napoleon before Napoleon left, because he couldn't have got the better of Napoleon in an argument. And essentially, he starts to denounce Napoleon's leadership. And then in January, he turns the command over to Eugene and clears off back home to Naples to work out what he can do to distance himself from Napoleon and hopefully keep his hands on his throne if Napoleon's star was on the decline. So he opens up negotiations with the Austrians and the British, trying to retain his kingdom. And this, for me, is where I get slightly confused at the venom that Bernadotte, who was acting in the interests of the kingdom he was appointed to lead, and Marmont, who had seen the enemy come to the very gates of Paris, they don't seem to level the same venom at Murat, who was acting out of pure self-interest. And he was Napoleon's brother-in-law. He wasn't a sort of distant rival who was never bosom friends with him, a la Bernadotte. He wasn't a disillusioned, well, he potentially was disillusioned, but he hadn't been through and seen France suffer in the way that Marmont had. He went, crap, things are going bad here. I need to look after my own interest. And Napoleon personally wrote to him to return to France. And he wrote to Caroline basically saying, you know, I always knew Murat was a fool, but I was expecting better of you, and where's the loyalty? And Murat does essentially come back for 1813 and again performs reasonably well. He serves at Dresden, he serves at Leipzig, and at Leipzig, Murat again has this sort of epiphany where he thought maybe Napoleon was getting his act together and things would be potentially fixable, but there's no coming back from Leipzig, and he again thinks, I've given it my chance, but I need to look after my own throne, and goes right back to Naples, telling Napoleon he's going to raise more troops, and never sees Napoleon again, and enters back into negotiations with Britain and Austria, basically saying, what do I need to do for you to let me keep my throne? Which is a massive simplification, but that's what he's interested in. He wants to remain King Joachim. And so the Allies find this useful idiot. They've spent 2 decades trying to get, Napoleon, well, not Napoleon off the throne. He hasn't been emperor for 2 decades, but interfering in the leadership of France ever since the Revolution, trying to unseat the convention and the Directory, and then Napoleon. The notion that they're suddenly going to let this complete upstart who, like Napoleon, has come from relative obscurity, has none of Napoleon's strengths, some more of his weaknesses, like they're going to accept this guy on the throne of Naples, is real sort of naivety on Murat's part. But they promise him he can keep his throne if he will bring 30,000 Neapolitan troops against France. And Murat does. So for me, if we're going to talk about traitors to Napoleon among the Marshalate, Murat's candidate number 1.
It's a staggering story, right? It's the ultimate sort of snake turning around and biting you kind of moment. Let's just try and give him the benefit of the doubt on either of the situations in which he I was going to use the word scuttles back to Naples, but that implies a loaded question. So let me rephrase that. In either of the instances where he decides to head back to Naples with an eye on the throne, are there the indications that there is discontent at home, and therefore, he's going back in order to, air quotes, steady the ship, in the same way that when people critique Napoleon for abandoning the army as soon as he crosses back into out of Russia and into Europe, he goes straight back to Paris ostensibly to steady the ship because there is the coup and the disgruntlement back in Paris. Is there an equivalent for Murat which you can use by way of justification?
I think not necessarily an equivalent, but you could say, to do him credit, he was potentially going home to look after Neapolitan interests. And I think if he had just gone home to steady the ship, I would potentially look on him with slightly less contempt. It's the fact that he gets home and one of the first things he does is open negotiations with the Allies. And that to me is where the distinction of, he was trying to look after his kingdom versus he was trying to hold on to his throne, is where he differs from Marmont and Bernadotte for me.
I love the fact that you don't even disguise the fact that the word we're dealing with here is contempt. It's just absolutely no questions. I love it when people nail their colours to the mast and can provide the arguments to back it up. Let's talk about the 1815 episode, because of course it's not all over then.
No,
this strikes me as very, very, very odd.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to get your head around. And again, I can't think of a better word to describe Murat's life than dramatic. And 1815 is that to a T. And the quote, the episode we did, Bernadotte, I said, there's that quote from Game of Thrones, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, and Bernadotte won. Murat didn't. He played the Game of Thrones and he did not win. By 1815, he had realised he was effectively being used by the Allies. And despite, they had made all these promises to him, so, and with no intention of honouring them, just in case people think I'm critiquing France from a point of view that the Allies were the noble good guys. Absolutely not. And they were stringing Murat along with the notion that he'll perform his service and then we can get him out of the way. And when Napoleon re-emerged, the Allies go back to Murat and try to say, the same, oh, if you help us, you can retain your throne. By this point, Murat's got enough sense to understand that they've no intention of helping him stay King Joachim. They're sorting not, everything out to keep a Bourbon on the throne of France. They're not going to sort of turn a blind eye to him sitting on another Bourbon throne. So he's in this situation where he's thrown away his loyalty to Napoleon and gambled with the Allies. The Allies don't respect him. They were using him. It's going to go nowhere. So he decides what he is going to do is go back to Napoleon. Now, Napoleon has on other occasions shown almost a ludicrous level of forgiveness for personal betrayals. And I think he thinks he can talk his brother-in-law round. So he had been beaten in Naples, and he thinks, right, I need to get back and get in Napoleon's good books. So he disguises himself, gets to France with the intention of offering himself as a cavalry commander to Napoleon. Napoleon refuses to meet him. And that's quite interesting because it shows a step up in Napoleon's much harder, I think, in terms of his sentiment when he comes back in 1815. And he basically tells Murat, or through messengers, to get stuff, and he wants nothing to do with him and won't see him, which leaves Murat in a very difficult position because there's a price on his head. He is a wanted man. Napoleon doesn't want to see him, so there's no protection for him in Naples or in France. He has the option of taking refuge in Austria alongside his wife, where he could live a life of relative obscurity, but they weren't going to be cast into poverty. They would live a pretty genteel existence, but he would have to take a step back from centre stage. And I don't know if it's just he couldn't bear the thought of not being a great figure, if it was the fact that he genuinely was so attached to the leadership of Naples, he was so passionate about the country, he wanted to go back and fight for it. Who knows what motivated him, but he decided to throw everything away on one last insane gamble for his throne. So he bought passage to Corsica, missed the boat, and had to take refuge in the hut of an old soldier. Again, he's offered asylum by the Emperor of Austria, but I don't know whether he thought, well, the Allies have promised me something once before and had reneged on agreements because they promised me I'd keep my throne and then manoeuvred against me. Stuff it, I'll take my chance myself. So he goes to retake his crown. So he sets sail with 250 men for Naples, but this effort is doomed from day one. So he's separated from the majority of his force by a storm. Then the captain of the vessel he's on refuses to go any further without provisioning. So Murat goes ashore with 30 of his men to try and buy some provisions. So he's with an incredibly small force when he lands, and he's recognised by some fishermen who start shouting initially, "Long live King Joachim." And this obviously kind of appeals to him, and I think he thinks potentially he's going to be able to do this with a very small force. Maybe he's thinking about Napoleon's return from Elba, where he effectively walks back into Paris without, a drop of blood being spilled. But something happens in the crowd. There's a shift in the mood. It seems to be going well. And then the crowd turns against him. And Murat's a man who's lived through the revolution. He understands when a crowd turns against you, you get out. And he and his men start to retreat to the boats. but they're captured before he can reach safety and is thrown into prison and put on trial. He, against any counsel, decides he's going to defend himself and argues that, give him his due, his thought for his men. He immediately argues that none of his soldiers should be tried with him because their only crime was being loyal to him and following his instructions. So I'll give him his due there. Even in that sort of last desperate corner, he thinks about the welfare of his men. He declared, again, with perhaps a lack of sort of political awareness, that the court was incompetent to try him because they couldn't try him as a Frenchman. Equally, if they were trying him as a Neapolitan, they had no ability to try him because he was their king. This doesn't go down well, and it is effectively a farcical kangaroo court. He's tried with a view to executing him, and within half an hour, he's found guilty, condemned to death. And like Marshal Ney, he ends his days before a firing squad. So he's brought out, I've got the words of his last letter, he's brought out to face a 12-man firing squad who are positioned only 10 feet away from him. And he's given leave to write one last letter to his wife. So he writes, "My dear Caroline, my last hour has come. In a few minutes, I shall have ceased to exist. You will no longer have a husband, and my children will no longer have a father. Never forget me. My life has not been tainted by any injustice." I think the Spanish would disagree, Murat. "Farewell, my Achille. Farewell, my Letizia. Farewell, Lucien. Farewell, my Louise. Show yourselves to the world worthy of me. I leave you without kingdom and without property in the midst of my numerous enemies. Be constantly united. Show yourself superior to misfortune. Think of what you are and what you have been, and God will bless you. Do not curse my memory. Know that my greatest pain in my last moments of my life is to die so far away from my children. Receive my paternal blessing. Receive my kisses and tears. Always have present in your memory your unfortunate father." Declined a blindfold, declined a stool, held a portrait of his wife and children in his hand, put it across his heart, and gave the order himself. Said famously, "Aim straight for my heart, spare my face," and gave the order to fire. And that was the end of Marshal Murat.
Ballsy to the end, flamboyant to the end.
Sure.
It's a story that is, it's almost designed to inspire, right? You know, there's somebody who genuinely looks death in the face. And as we said at the start, you know, if you like that swashbuckling, that flamboyance, that unquestioned bravery in the face of all odds, Murat's your cup of tea until the end.
Yeah.
But yes, still a bit of an idiot. I think we can safely say, Rachel, it's always fascinating to have you on and to talk to you. Thank you so much. I think we were fair on this one. I when we first suggested it, I thought we were just going to bash him and kind of giggle our way through this, and we didn't. We were professional, and I think we were perfectly reasonable.
I think so.
I think
we've given him his due where it's reasonable, and called him an idiot where it's reasonable.
I mean, do I stand by my comment that if you ever had a conversation with Murat, you'd come away with a renewed appreciation of the intellect of the horse that he was riding? Perhaps that's a little bit harsh. Perhaps it's just a little bit harsh. But yeah, as you said yourself, you know, all balls, no brains, and a man who didn't really know what to do with a problem that he couldn't charge at, shoot, or sleep with. And on that, we will leave it. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachael Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.